Now that we've seen how to manipulate file permissions from the command line, I want us to see how we can do that in PHP. Before we can get started on that, we first need to talk about something in PHP called safe mode. Back at the beginning of this title, we created a my_php_info file that just simply brings up the PHP info script. And we can bring that up in a browser and take a look. So here we are at the main page for PHP info. If you do a search for safe mode, you'll see that it comes up and gives us safe mode for me is off. Now yours may say on. It's not so important whether it's on or off, is that you know how to change it and what it does. The way that you change it is you go into your php.ini file and you turn it on or off, and then you just restart your web server so that it reloads those new changes for PHP. That's how you turn it on and off. What safe mode does is that when safe mode is on, PHP checks to see if the owner of the current PHP script that's running matches the owner of the file that you want to manipulate. So if safe mode is on, we don't have the ability to manipulate files that we don't own. Now this is a feature that was added mostly for shared hosting environments. It's eventually going to go away in PHP. It's not strictly necessary for you to have it on, certainly in your development environment, and even in your production environment. But if you're going to be manipulating files that you don't own, you will need safe mode to be off. Now that we know about safe mode, let's create a file where we can start working with our PHP. So I'll open up TextMate and I'll make a new file, and I'm going to save it in my B2B sandbox, and I'm going to call it filechanger.php. Now that may sound like an odd name, but what I'm after here is that this file is going to be where we manipulate another file, and the other file we're going to manipulate is going to be file permissions, the one we were working with from the last movie. So filechanger will be the currently running script. File permissions will be the one that we're going to manipulate. Let's take a look from the terminal. Remember I said you could do ls-la. I'm also going to use that upright pipe followed by grep and then file underscore. This will come back and just give me the lines that are related to file underscore in the name. So we can see the basics file. We're not interested in that one, but we can see changer and we can see permissions. Now for me, changer is owned by Kevin. www, though, owns file permissions because we changed it to be that. You may have changed it back, or it may be something else. So if we have safe mode on, filechanger will not be able to make any changes to file permissions because they have different owners. It doesn't matter what permissions are set over here. Even if we're allowed to execute things, PHP will intervene and say, sorry, I'm not going to let you do that. Instead, I think it's better to have safe mode off, and then we can control which things we allow PHP to do by using the file permissions. So to start with, let's take a look at the file owner function. So file owner, and this will tell us the owner of a file. And we're going to say file permissions.php. That's the file that we want to look at. Now notice here I just provided simply a string with the file name. It's going to assume it's in the same directory. If it was somewhere else, I could say ... back to get it to go back a directory, or I could use an absolute path. We saw how to do that with file plus and so on. But it's going to just assume it's in the same directory. So let's bring this up in a browser and see what we get if we ask for just the file owner. So here we are with file permissions, and I now want to run filechanger. It came back with 70. Now that's not particularly useful. It didn't give me www. Instead, what it gave me was the ID of the user, because that's what is stored there, and that's what's easiest for it to find. Now we can compare IDs between this file and a different file, but in order to find out the name, it's a little bit trickier. And what we're going to need to do is make use of a library that is probably not installed on Windows and even may not be installed on a Linux, Unix, or Mac machine. It's called the POSIX library. So if we have POSIX installed, then we can do it a little bit differently. Instead, we can say that the owner ID is equal to this, and then we'll pull back an owner array by saying POSIX get PWUID. That'll get the user ID from the password file for the owner ID. Owner ID. So look it up for us. And then once we get that array of information back about the owner, then we'll pull out the part that we want. Owner array, just the name. And you can take a look at the full array if you want to see what else it gives you. So let's try that now. We'll go back to Firefox, we'll reload it, and you'll see we get the www. I'll go ahead and just put in echo br, just so that we have a nice break there. Now that we have the owner name, we might want to now change the owner. for example, from www to Kevin or to your name. So we saw do that before with chown. We still have chown available to us in PHP, but it's going to be so problematic, it's basically unusable. I'll show you why. We first need to provide the file name that we want to change the ownership of, and then we need to provide the new owner name. So for me, I'm going to put in Kevin. You can put in your name, whatever you had before, or a different user. Nobody is also probably a user you could use. So I'll save it. Now, before I try this in a web browser, let's go ahead then and do this same echo statement back again, just so we can see who the owner is after we've done the chown statement. Now, keep in mind, before I run this, that safe mode is off for me. So that's not stopping us from making this change. And you'll remember, if we look back at the terminal, that this file is set to both read and write for anyone. So read and write is not the issue. It's not a permissions problem. So let's now switch back over to Firefox and let's try it out. FileChanger.php, and it comes up and it says, warning, operation not permitted. Now, the reason why it's not permitted, you can see in the documentation for chown on the php.net website. It attempts to change the owner of the file, but only the superuser may change the owner of a file. That's a pretty big restriction. You remember when we did chown from the command line, we typed in sudo. That made us temporarily the superuser, so that we had superuser privileges. Well, PHP insists that we always have to be the superuser if we're going to change the owner of the file. That means that our web server has to be a superuser. Now that creates a pretty big security issue for us if we let our web server have those top-level access privileges. So for that reason, I don't recommend it. And I think that makes chown virtually unusable in PHP. So it does exist, you do have the ability to use it, but I don't recommend it. Instead, we're going to want to stick with chmod and changing the privileges so that the privileges allow the right person to access the right file. So let's switch back to our file changer, and I'm just going to make a note here that says chown only works if PHP is superuser, making web server /PHP a superuser is a big security issue. But unlike chown, we can use chmod. So let's see how we can do that. First, let's see what the permissions are. So we'll say echo file perms for file permissions, and then we're going to use this same file. I'll just copy and paste file perms, and let's see what it gives us back. Let's go to Firefox, reload, and you'll see it gives us 33206. Now that doesn't translate to anything that we've talked about so far. Threes were not part of that code that we were using to change to octals, and this is not symbolic notation. What this is a decimal representation. So in order to make it usable, we need to use a simple function called DECOCT, which is basically convert from a decimal to an octal. So this is one of the only times you're going to use it, DECOCT, and surround it. Then we'll come back and we'll say, all right, Firefox, now give it to me. And it comes back and says 100666. Now the important part are these last four numbers. The last three is what we're used to seeing as an octal. The fourth one is also going to be something that PHP is going to want us to use. And in fact, if you really want to get just the important part, you can use substring function wrapped around there, comma 2, and then when we go back to Firefox, it'll return just those 4 characters of the file permissions. Now that we have that, let's try and use chmod to change it. So we're going to change it on filepermissions.php. And let's go ahead and say that the file permissions ought to be 777. Now there's one big change that we need here. We need to put that 0 in front of it. So PHP is always going to want to have that 0 in the first place. So 0 and then the octal number that we're used to using. So let's try that, and then after it's done, let's echo back the change so we'll see the difference. So now we'll switch back over to Firefox and we'll try it out. So we'll hit reload. It came back the same thing. Let's reload it one more time. There it goes. Now that we see the change took place. So the change of the permissions did take place. We just had to reload our page an extra time to be able to see them. Now, it's not very convenient to have to check this octal to figure out whether something is readable or writable to you. Instead, the better way to do it is to use is readable and is writable, and use those as tests for whether or not we can read or write to the file. So let's paste in the file name there. So is it readable or is it writable? It's a Boolean expression. So we want it to return yes or no. And I'll just put that down here as well. We'll need our semicolons, and we'll need to echo the value just so that we can see it. So that'll just give us a quick, is that file readable? Is that file writable? And let's just grab our BR tag here just so that it's nice and clean. All right, let's try that out. So is readable or is writable? Yes, it is readable and it is writable. If we change this now to be something like 444, save it. Let's go back to Firefox, reload it. Yes, it is readable. No, it's not writable. Now, we didn't see the file permission change there. If we reload a second time, we'll actually see it. It had cached it. So it did right away know, though, whether it was readable or writable. So is readable, is writable are the methods that we'll use to find out if something is readable or writable, and we'll use chmod if we want to change the permissions.